Hello everyone. Right now it's the season of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and because of that there's a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 where Paul speaks of the Passover and of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and I've been thinking about it lately just because, hey, it's the season. And there are certain principles that we can learn from this passage, and not only the passage, but how it has been understood, that I think are very important for us to consider. So I wanted to make this video to discuss this principle with all of you. So first I'll just read the passage. Again, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verses 7 and 8, and Paul here is addressing the subject of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So this is what it says. Purge out, therefore, the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. For even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So the part of this that I want to focus on primarily is the last part of verse 7 and the first part of verse 8, which again, here Paul says, "For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast." So that's the section that I wanted to look at. Now, in order to address this principle, we have to kind of get a little bit of understanding of how most people understand this passage and Paul's writings in general. So what I'm about to say isn't really any news to you, most likely, but I think it's really important to keep in mind in order to understand this principle. So the general idea that most Christians have is that at the crucifixion, the law of Moses was abolished or done away with, and that from that point on, it's not really necessary or important to keep the feasts such as Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread that Paul is speaking of in this verse. And, that perspective is most often attributed to Paul as being at least the champion of that perspective in the New Testament. So it's interesting to say, okay, this is how we typically understand it. Let's see what Paul is saying here. So I want to read this passage again, and we just want to try and understand what is Paul saying. So Paul, let's keep things in the perspective of reality. The letter of Corinthians, at one point, originally, it was just an independent letter that Paul wrote to the believers in a place called Corinth. So it wasn't originally, bound within these covers and had the name Holy Bible on the front. No, originally, it was just a letter that Paul wrote, and he probably didn't have it in mind at all that it would later be collected and put in a single book with other letters and writings of other people and so on. He's just writing a letter to these people to convey the message that he believed that God had given him. So let's try to keep that in mind, because it's always important to look at the original context and the person's perspective and to be thinking of them while we're reading what they wrote. And we'll talk about this more as we continue. But this is what Paul says again. He says, "For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast." Okay, so we have the plain statement of Paul saying, "Therefore let us keep the feast." He says, Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast. Now notice how different that is from the common understanding. The common understanding is Christ is sacrificed for us, therefore let us not keep the feast. Now isn't that incredible? That we are capable of interpreting a passage to mean just the opposite of what it actually says. That should be somewhat striking to us, and we should wonder, how has that come about? Now I myself, just so you know, I have done this same thing. I have, initially I interpreted this passage to be saying the same thing. And why did I do that? Well, because I had the thought in mind that, well, hey, these feasts and all these Jewish laws are all abolished. They're all done away with. So Paul couldn't be saying, let's keep the feast. No, he's really trying to say, maybe he's just using the phrase feast as some kind of somewhat mystical metaphor. I didn't really have a clear understanding of what he was saying, but surely he couldn't be saying, let's keep the feast. So I came to it with my preconceived ideas, and thus I interpreted it in a way that actually ended up totally flipping it on its head. Therefore, let us not keep the feast, is what I was thinking. And I know that's what the majority of Christendom also thinks, because that is what is taught. Now, here's the thing. If that's possible to do this in this passage, well, is it possible that this may have been done with other passages? Is this something that is widely done, perhaps without us even realizing it? How many passages are we interpreting to mean just the opposite of what they plainly say? Now, it's interesting with this particular passage. One of the things that's so interesting is that Paul, in talking about keeping the feast, he says to keep it not with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Okay, so we have this unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. He's clearly understanding the unleavened bread of the feast to be representative of sincerity and truth, and he's understanding leaven to be representative of malice and wickedness. Now, this is very, very broad. Malice and wickedness, those are very broad ideas. Sincerity and truth, very, very broad ideas. So we're not going to be able to discuss those in their full breadth. But I would like to discuss it briefly with you in relationship to this idea that we're talking about, coming to these various texts, and how do we understand them. Now, I hope that you can see that if we come to a text and we interpret it in such a way that makes it mean just the opposite of what it says, that's not in keeping with sincerity and truth. That's more on the side of malice and wickedness. It's dealing with the text unjustly. Now, anyone here, if any of you have written anything, or even if you just said something, how is it when someone comes and then they understand you to mean something other than what you actually mean, and other than what you actually said? Perhaps you even said it quite plainly, and someone comes along and they interpret it in a way that is just the opposite of what you meant, just the opposite of what you said, and then go around saying, hey, John said such and such, and if your name's John, and you're saying, actually, I didn't say that. I said just the opposite of that. That's your interpretation of what I said. We recognize that someone misinterpreting our words, whether words that we've just spoken audibly or written, people misinterpreting them and then passing it off as though that's what we really said, we understand that as unethical and unjust. It's unjust dealing with our words. So here's the thing. It's so important that we take a look and say, okay, are we understanding people within their own meaning? Are we giving people the freedom to mean what they were intending to mean rather than what we want them to mean? Now, of course, this is broad and far-reaching, but it's so important for us to have these principles in mind in all situations in life. And so I want to ask you all to investigate yourselves, to examine yourselves, and to see whether you are doing this, whether you are misinterpreting people, or if you're allowing them to just mean what they originally meant. Now, in order to kind of help or to encourage this type of self-examination, I just want to mention a few more things. In order to know whether you are actually allowing someone to speak with their own intentions, you have to kind of pay attention to what their intentions are. So let's just examine ourselves briefly and say, are we paying attention to someone's intentions? So I want to ask you, do you understand, as you read the New Testament, just for example, you read, let's say, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, they're all very similar, but they're written by different authors, right? So are you aware of their intentions? Could you explain to someone the intentions of the author of Matthew and how that's different from the intentions of the author of Mark or of Luke or of John? How about Paul's different letters? Obviously, in each letter, he's writing to different people about different things. Are you aware of his intentions in writing, let's say, 1 Corinthians, and how that differs from Paul's intentions in writing Romans? Now, if you're not aware in any of those examples that I've just mentioned, perhaps that should be an indication to you that in reading the New Testament, you haven't been looking for their intention. And if you haven't been looking for their intention, what have you had in mind? Could it perhaps be something that you're looking for, either for your own spiritual benefit or in order to gain a certain understanding or evidence a certain point that you believe to be true? No matter what it is, if you're not approaching it with the intentions of the author in mind, seeking to understand their intentions, how easy would it be to end up, even inadvertently, taking their words and understanding them in a way that they didn't intend? And even if you understand them in a way that they did intend, how do you know if you're not paying attention to their intentions? So, very, very important to consider these things, and I hope that you all do. And I know that the majority of us, myself included, have not been in the habit of just paying attention to the intentions of the authors we read, especially when it comes to the Bible for some reason. So I encourage every one of you to do that, and that will help you, as it is helping me in practicing this, in paying attention to the intentions of the author. It helps me to not take their words and apply them differently than how they would have want them applied. And this keeps us from unjustly using texts. We need to learn to approach things in sincerity and truth, and not to expect texts to line up to our preconceived ideas of what they should say or of what they shouldn't say. And this, by the way, it not only applies to texts that we align ourselves with and that we profess to agree with, this also applies to either written texts or audible words of those whom we may deem enemies even. Often we think, oh, well, this person is, a heretic, or this person is crazy, or whatever it may be. And so we understand their words within the framework that we have cast upon them, rather than letting them speak for themselves. So it's important for all of us to really seek to understand what someone is trying to say in all circumstances, whether it's someone we agree with or whether it's someone we disagree with. We need to be able to approach things honestly. If it's someone that we agree with, well, we need to know what they're actually saying so that we can actually know whether we agree with them, rather than it just being a mere profession. And if it's someone who we disagree with, it's important to know what they are actually saying so that we don't end up misrepresenting them and, tearing down our version of what they're saying. Because you know what? Our version of what they're saying, if we tear it down, and it's a misrepresentation of what they're actually saying, we've only set up a straw man, and we've only taken down the straw man. If we want to address error, we have to address it for what it is. So we have to allow each person to say what they are intending to say and really seek to understand them. So that's what I really want to encourage everyone to do. And I hope that this has been helpful in discussing these principles. I would love to discuss it with any of you. If you want to discuss it, comment below. Whether you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook or wherever else, you can contact me and we can discuss these things. But anyway, I hope that you all take these things and investigate yourselves, that you may live according to the principles of sincerity and truth. All right, well, blessings everyone. Farewell.